Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started now. I'm Max Frazier, Associate Nonfiction Editor for Consequence Magazine, and welcome to tonight's Of Consequence Forum, in conversation between Matt Armstrong, author of the Mysteries of Haditha, and Andria Williams, an editor at the Wrath-Bearing Tree. They will discuss Matt's memoir about his improbable journey to embed with Special Forces units in Iraq. If you watch the Zoom chat, you can see website links for the co-sponsors of this forum as I announce them. Tonight's event is being co-sponsored by Consequence Magazine, the Wrath-Bearing Tree, Matt's local bookstore, Scuppernong Books, and the Paul Pratt Memorial Library. Thank you, everyone, for helping make this event a success. First, a few electronic ground rules. Because of the size of the audience, we ask that you keep your microphones muted. We choose to show names and faces so you can see your compatriots in our community, but we'll be keeping Matt and Andria as our primary focus. Please ask your questions on the Zoom general chat, and we will funnel them to Andria. We'll be ending right at 8 p.m. If we don't get to your question, or if you have additional questions for Matt or Andria, please email those questions to Consequence Magazine through our website, and we'll make sure that they get them. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Matt and Andria. MC Armstrong, Matt, is the author of the Mysteries of Haditha from Potomac Books. He was embedded with Joint Special Operations Forces in Al-Anbar Province, Iraq. He published extensively on the Iraq War through the Winchester, Virginia Star, and is the winner of a Pushcart Prize. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Esquire, Missouri Review, Gettysburg Review, Mayday, The Wrath-Bearing Tree, Monkey Bicycle, Epiphany, Literary Review, and other journals and anthologies. He lives in Greensboro, North Carolina. Andria Williams, editor at The Wrath-Bearing Tree, is the author of The Longest Night from Random House 2016, which was Amazon's debut novel for January of that year, and a Barnes & Noble Discover pick. Since 2014, she has been the editor of the Military Spouse Book Review, which publishes essays and book reviews by women connected to the military. Andria grew up in Northern California with public school teacher parents, got her English degree from UC Berkeley and her MFA in fiction writing from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Andria, I'll turn things over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight, Zooming on your Friday night. I am really happy to be here. I am a huge fan of Matt Armstrong's, and I absolutely love his memoir, The Mysteries of Haditha. And some of the things I find so unique about it are it's incredibly engaging voice, its humor, and also the seriousness with which it deals with all manner of topics. And Matt, I know, is going to do a reading for us from the memoir, but I wanted to first let you all, just in case you didn't know sort of the backstory of the memoir, to get a little bit of a feel for how he came to find himself in Iraq as a civilian. So I'll start to set the stage, and then Matt, you can kind of just take it from there and fill in the blanks for me. But what I understand is that your childhood best friend was in Iraq with the Navy SEALs. And so Matt and his childhood best friend had grown up as kind of this sort of opposite pair in Winchester, Virginia. And Matt was eat boy, and his Navy SEAL friend was diet. And they were sort of these opposites, this sort of like military sort of stoicism versus the guy who enjoys life, you know, who enjoys music and the Grateful Dead and all of that. So Diet ends up in Iraq. He's stationed near Haditha. And Matt has gone through a series of pretty like shaking life events. At the end of an engagement, his mother is ill. And all of a sudden he finds himself determined to go to Iraq. So he needs a sponsor, right? So he's going to be a journalist. So he decides to try to get the local, very small newspaper, the Winchester Star, to sponsor him. And at first it's looking great. He talks to an old sort of family friend, but kind of a man with sort of adversarial politics to his own mother's liberalism. And it looks like it's a go. He's going to be sent to Haditha. He's going to get to embed and report. But his dad sabotages this from the back end. And suddenly Matt is without a sponsor. And his solution to that is quite entertaining and delightful. So Matt, I will let you take over from here and give everyone a little bit of background as to how you got to Iraq.
Thank you, Andrea. And thanks, Max. And thank you, Kat, for putting this together. This is really special. Thank you, guys. Yeah, this was a very loaded moment in my life. And I think it really reflects in interesting ways upon small town life in America. My dad was a doctor in the same town as the editor of the Winchester Star. And as Andrea just told you, the Winchester Star initially agreed to sponsor me, but because the editor was a patient of my father's, perhaps while sitting on the exam room table one day, my father said to him, you know, if anything happens to my son over there in Iraq, you're going to be legally liable. And in that moment, everything changed. He withdrew sponsorship. His name was Tom Bird. He was the editor of the Winchester Star. He withdrew sponsorship. He called me and he said, Mr. Armstrong, I'm sorry, we're going to have to withdraw sponsorship. I said, why? He said, you don't have any experience in a combat zone. I said, how am I going to get any experience in a combat zone if some editor doesn't take that initial risk on me? It was a kind of catch-22. Well, he didn't tell me the truth of what happened, which was that my father had threatened him there in the office. He just told me I didn't have any experience, so I was on my own. So that was a kind of existential crisis. Do I give up or do I not? And I didn't want to give up. I wanted to see Iraq for myself. So I came up with the idea, and I've got this, where is it here? Right here. I came up with the idea of coming up with my own magazine. And I needed an accomplice in this. So I was teaching at North Carolina A&T at the time, the alma mater of the mastermind of 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and one of my colleagues, Kevin Rippin, who, as I do describe in the book, a penguin-shaped poet. I said to him, what if we cook up a magazine? What if we cook up a scholarly journal that could send me to Iraq? I would just need an editor who could give me bona fides, who could give me credentials. So long story short, the penguin-shaped poet conspires with me, the broke writer, to build a magazine, which we eventually did build. I think for legal purposes, I'd like this shown here, that we did eventually build it. But when I got into Iraq, we had never published a single issue. And to just show you what an amateur I was going into Iraq, when I got there, I had Kevin Rippin's letter of accreditation with me, and I was the only journalist, according to the people at CPIC in Baghdad, I was the only journalist they'd ever met in 5 years who had his letter of accreditation laminated. They also said I was the only journalist they'd ever met who smiled for his ID pic, which on the back talks about what happens in case you get, killed or kidnapped. Obviously, I hadn't got the memo about taking things too seriously. So yeah, that was how I got to Iraq. Thank you, Convergence Review. Thank you, Kevin Rippin. Thank you, American Ingenuity.
Well, I think you owe Kevin a huge debt. And I really like the part where he kind of, you guys are talking about what a wonderful idea this is. Oh, we're going to make a fake literary journal. Oh, I'm going to Iraq. And then all of a sudden he kind of sobers up and he's like, Matt, it won't be any fun if you're fucking dead. And you're kind of like, yeah, you're right, it won't. But you went anyway. And so you get to Haditha and you meet up with Diet. Do you want to talk a little bit about your childhood relationship with this dear friend of yours?
Yeah, I'll give folks sort of the very quick backstory on the names. Diet was one of my best friends. As Andrea said, we were sort of a study in opposites, but we really became a study in opposites. We weren't so different when the nicknames first descended, and the nicknames kind of came from a day when I was 15 and he was 16, and he had a car or a truck. It was kind of a car, it was kind of a truck. It was a Subaru Brat. You guys remember the Subaru Brat? They were They were the shape of a truck, but the size of a car. Anyways, he had one of these, and because he was 16, he'd sometimes drive a bunch of us away from high school around lunchtime so we could get a fast food lunch, which we thought was the greatest thing in the world. Rather than eating a cafeteria, let's go get some lunch. I ended up getting this meatball sandwich, and I'm eating the meatball sandwich in his brat, and this big marinara-soaked meatball just pops out of the sandwich and goes right down onto the upholstery of his brat. And he just looks at me, he's like, "God damn it, Eat Boy." Like that, you know. Eat Boy was the guy who always makes the mess. And that was sort of the moment that the name was consecrated. Diet, because there was this guy in our group whose name was Grover, and Diet was seen as the more disciplined version of this guy. He was initially named Diet Grover, but it eventually just became Diet. And so by the time we get to the end of high school, we are these two people who clearly do have slightly different outlooks on life, but we have these nicknames which suggest we're polar opposites. And that becomes really interesting by the time we get much older. And he's a soldier, you know, I'm a hippie.
Do you think you would have followed him to Iraq if you had not been opposites?
You know, I probably wouldn't have followed him to Iraq if he hadn't followed me to Cambridge, England 10 years earlier, when I went over there right before thinking I was going to law school to study English. And at that moment in my life, I suddenly decided I wanted to become a writer. And when he found out about this, he got on his C-130 Hercules himself and flew over to see me. And that was like a big kind of consideration in my head when I decided to go over there. That more than anything. He had come to see me during my moment of trial at a time in my life when everything was up in the air. And I wanted to extend the same to him.
It's such a unique story because I knew several people who were in the war in Iraq. It never occurred to me to try to visit them. You know, like, I would have loved to, but who thinks this way? On that level, it's really fascinating. And I'm kind of struck by this word that you just used, mess. So you dropped this meatball sub in the back of the brat. I want to say brat, like a brat.
Subaru brat, the brat and the brat.
The brat. And so he tells you to clean up this mess. And that what interests me about that is that you get to Iraq, and this is a really common refrain that you start hearing from people there and from Diet himself. We are here to clean up this mess. We just need to clean up this mess, then we can get out. Do you want to share some of your thoughts about that? Because it seems like at the start you were kind of buying into this idea more, and how your thoughts evolved.
Yeah, no, that's a really smart observation. When I got there, I went in, I suspect like anybody goes into any situation with my own ideas about how everybody else would see the war, how soldiers in particular would see the war. And I was very taken by the way Diet would describe Iraq to me, which was very different from what I was hearing in the mainstream media before I got over there. I was sort of hearing the binary. It's a bullshit criminal war crime war on the one hand. It is an absolutely justified war because Iraq had something to do with 9/11 and had these WMDs on the other. Diet's position was more nuanced. He could see that that there were problems, and he saw and acknowledged that the beginning of the Iraq invasion was an absolute disaster. But in saying what he constantly said, which was, it's a mess, but we have to clean it up, he was acknowledging both the problems and I thought a code of responsibility, which I admired. So I really respected his position. And at least at that time in the history of the war, during the Al Anbar awakening, I think that position was a smart bet. Attacks were going down. Security did seem to be working. What the SEALs were doing in Haditha, which was providing micro grants to a lot of the Iraqis there, it seemed, they were creating jobs. They were doing stuff that you would normally see Peace Corps people doing. They were building power lines. They were helping reconstruct Haditha's infrastructure. It seemed to be working. So that idea of cleaning up the mess in 2008, it didn't seem evasive. It didn't seem ethical. To me, it seemed like a responsible way of framing our position in Iraq at that moment.
I want to make sure you have enough time to read whatever excerpt you prepared and allow for plenty of questions and that sort of thing. So I don't know if you have something chosen that you want to read for us and give a little intro.
Sure. I'll start with the beginning of the book because this was initially published by you guys, Andrea. This was published by Raspberry Tree. This book doesn't happen without Raspberry Tree or Consequence. The first chapter of this book was published with Raspberry Tree about 2 years ago with a lot of help from Adrian Bonenberger, another one of the editors from Raspberry Tree. And chapter 5, which is the Burn Pits chapter, was first published in Consequence. So what I'd like to do is just read the first couple pages from chapter 1. And if there's time for another reading at the end, I know a guy named John Nye made a request for the Bumpa chapter. So maybe we have time for that, maybe we don't, but I'd like to give everybody a chance to sort of see the book without context. Just jump right in. So here we go. And the book always begins each chapter with a little bit of graffiti from the bathroom of Iraq. And this first piece of graffiti is, "Why write? Draw naked chicks." I met a woman on my way to Iraq. Just before I stepped onto the midnight plane to Baghdad, she asked me what should have been a simple question. "Who do you work for?" Her name was Moni Basu. She was a journalist. She had thick dark hair, and she wore a media chick. We were drinking coffee at a picnic table behind a beverage kiosk at the back of the Ali Al Salam base in Kuwait. Her traveling companion, a photographer named Curtis Compton, had caught shrapnel from an IED during a previous embed. A moment before, Moni had given me, a rookie journalist, an important Arabic term, mutar saif. It means lies, bullshit, or summer rain, a thing that just didn't happen in the desert. I told her I worked for a magazine called CQ. GQ? No, CQ. You write for Congressional Quarterly? The questions never stopped with Moni. She could smell the bullshit. Convergence Quarterly, I said. It's a new magazine. This will be our first issue. We're sponsored by North Carolina A&T. You work at North Carolina A&T? I nodded nervously. I'm white. A&T is a historically black college in Greensboro, North Carolina. Many people argue that the student protest movement of the 60s began at A&T when 4 courageous young men conducted a sit-in at a Woolworth's lunch counter on February 1st, 1960. This was the part of our history that we advertised to the world. Do you know who graduated from there, Moni asked. Jesse Jackson? Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? She said it like that, like a question, like she couldn't believe that I was here with her and didn't know this crucial fact. It was early March 2008, the 5th anniversary of the Iraq invasion. I'd been working at A&T as a lecturer in interdisciplinary writing for the past 3 years, but didn't know a thing about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. This is the guy who masterminded the attacks on 9/11, Moni said. You don't know who Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is? Moni glanced at Curtis, who was applying a cloth to a lens with calm circular strokes. It was just beginning to dawn on me that I might be in way over my head. Like maybe I was the man my father was afraid I was, a rube destined to die a ridiculous death in the coming days. My charred body hung from a bridge in some war-torn hamlet, men in loose-fitting garments cheering as my ashy corpse twisted in the wind. Or they put me in one of those orange jumpsuits and cut off my head, whoever they were. I took a long sip of my coffee. Surely whatever crush I had on Moni would not be reciprocated given my astounding ignorance about the war on terror. There I was, about to embed with Navy SEALs in Haditha, one of the most dangerous cities in Iraq, and I had no idea about the man who had started the very war I was trying to cover for a magazine that hadn't even released its first issue. I was 24 years old on 9/11. I did not question most of the official stories I heard emerging out of the early years of the war, and I certainly didn't think little Greensboro, North Carolina had anything to do with this grand geopolitical narrative. Yes, I was the guy who had traveled 7,000 miles to learn that the mastermind of 9/11 had been educated in my own backyard. Excuse me, I said. Rather than behave like a good journalist and question Moni relentlessly about Kay, I headed to the bathroom to attend to suddenly struggling bowels. I stared at the graffiti left by the troops. Chuck Norris's tears cure cancer. Too bad he never cries. Here I sit, cheeks a-flexin', ready to unleash another Texan. Here I sit upon the crapper, ready to produce another rapper. Can't wait to go home. Have a nice war. They called my bus. I put on my Army surplus helmet and bulletproof vest, jotted down a few notes about the jokes in the toilet. I sat close to Moni as the bus filled up. I didn't want to lose her. I felt like I needed her, and I wasn't used to that feeling, that fear. I was the guy who loved to live alone, the last of my friends to marry. But I didn't want to be left alone in Iraq. On the drive to the plane, I made small talk with Moni about the record-breaking drought back home. It's so bad in Atlanta, she said, that I keep a bucket in my shower just so I can save enough water for my garden. We walked across the tarmac and up the ramp into the loud, bloated hull of a C-130 Hercules. It was Moni, Curtis, and I, plus 4 soldiers and 2 contractors. The C-130 is an exposed experience, a cabin stripped of padding and panel, the seats nothing more than net and pole, the lights a dim red, white, and blue, the floor studded with traction pads. After the plane took off, Moni fell asleep, and so did one of the soldiers. Another sat with his headphones blasting so loud it sounded like spit was coming out of his ears. I smelled grape Kool-Aid powder. I looked around at the seemingly calm faces occasionally jostled by the turbulence. There was no turning back. For the past 6 months, I'd been obsessed with seeing the war for myself and escaping the media-saturated mindfuck of left versus right, peace versus war, WMDs, beheadings, and 9/11 conspiracy theories. I wanted to see the thing for myself and escape the self-absorbed American vortex of screens and social media. And now that I was here, I couldn't stop thinking about how blind I'd been to the very place I was escaping. America, my own backyard. Other than KSM, what else had I missed? Was I about to get kidnapped and beheaded? My father dropping to his knees in our front yard with photographers clipping pictures all around him, just like the dad of Nick Berg, the famous decapitated contractor? And we're contractors, those men snoozing all around me. Were they the bad guys like everybody said? Was America evil? And why were our troops so infatuated with Chuck Norris? A man who at the time I thought of as nothing more than an aging third-tier actor from a bunch of forgettable martial arts movies. All the lights went out in Hercules. The cabin a dark tunnel of jiggling multinational bodies as this massive airship began its spiral descent to Baghdad. The famous lights out, corkscrew, roller coaster free fall approach being the military's way of evading RPGs and demonstrating to rookie journalists just how simultaneously colossal and agile America can be if it truly wants to keep itself a secret.
Wow, what an opening. I love that opening. How simultaneously colossal and agile America can be if it truly wants to keep itself a secret. It's all underlined in my copy. I have a couple questions from the group, but I just have to say, one of the things I found most endearing about your memoir is the way you characterize your relationship with your mother. And you talk a lot about your mom and her sort of larger than life personality. Wild Mary Kay, is that her?
Wild Mary Kay was the name my friends gave her in high school, yeah.
But this one little anecdote I love that you just dropped very subtly is that when you leave for Iraq, she sends you a newspaper clipping about a guy who sat in a Humvee too long and died of like deep vein thrombosis. And I just love that because it seems like such a mom thing to do. Like, you're like, I might get beheaded, I might get shot at, I might get shot down. And she's like, if you sit too long in the Humvee, you're gonna get the Humvee, you're gonna get a blood clot. You need to move around. You need to do yoga. Like I do a little yoga.
Yes, yoga on the plane.
Stretching. Yeah, right. Yeah, do not sit for too long. So I love your mom, and she is a real treat in this memoir. So we have a couple of questions coming in from listeners. The first one is, why did you want to go to war, and did you get any embed training beforehand?
Okay. That question of why I went is one that I'd be a fool to answer glibly with anything simple. Now, I look back at that question and I question it all the time. What I can tell you is that when I heard from Diet, when he called me, or I called him back, and I found out that he was going to Haditha, my first thoughts, and I'm not proud of this, my first thoughts were not about the people of Haditha. It was not about the people of Iraq in the beginning. It was about Diet. He was a friend of mine, and I would say the two things that were in my head were, I wanted to see what he was up to because he was a friend, but also I had been living in small rooms watching the war on TV. I've been writing about the war as a writer, and I felt sort of trapped. I wanted out of that trap. I wanted out of these screens. I wanted to see the thing for myself. I'd been a history major in college, and I'd always been told by my professors, if you really want to understand a thing, you have to engage primary documents. You know, I wasn't getting primary documents. I wasn't talking to the people who were actually engaged in the war like everybody around me. I was watching CNN. I was watching Fox. I was doing what we're all doing as we're watching electoral politics right now. I was getting politicized. So I wanted out of that box. I wanted out of my small room, and I wanted to see what my friend was truly up to.
And did you receive any embed training before you went, or were you completely flying by the seat of your pants?
Because the Winchester Star withdrew sponsorship in the middle of the embed process, I didn't get the training that I would have gotten from them, because Convergence Quarterly was the magazine. It was therefore Convergence Quarterly's duty to provide me with that kind of training, which meant I had to train myself, which meant that I went to, at that time, Borders bookstore, and I bought a little booklet on a rack with like a crib sheet of Arabic terms, and I drilled them at home. I watched YouTube videos, but when it came to the body armor, when it came to all of that, as you'll see in the book, I was a total idiot. I didn't have any understanding of how endangered I was going in there with a level 1 body armor with this Army surplus helmet. I did, once I was at a base called Al Taqaddum, get some very quick instructions on a machine gun from my PAO, which I was glad for. But all of it was sort of building the plane in mid-flight.
So talk a little bit about this naivete that you're talking about, because you talk about this a lot in the book too, that at first you're really worried that it's going to be kind of your big downfall. You know nothing. You go over there and you just admit basically to anyone who will listen, like, I know nothing. You're telling it to yourself. I know, you know. And so, but then as you start talking to all these other people and realizing that maybe you're asking questions that anyone with any training would never ask, you start to realize that your naivete could sort of be a secret weapon. Like when you meet this wonderful, he's not a character, he's an actual person, this Captain Allah who has this mullet. You're trying to think of a conversation inroad with him, and so you ask him, like, why the mullet? And people around you are kind of like, why is he asking that? I thought he was here, you know, to find out about the Haditha massacre or all these other things that have happened in that area. So I was wondering if you might just say a couple of words about sort of your developing sense of what knowledge meant in your situation and how you sort of wielded it while you were there.
Yeah, Charlie Kaufman, the director, he recently gave a speech on being an artist, being a writer. And he said for him, the number one piece of advice, the number one thing he starts with is, I don't know. He says everything starts with that. And as I watched him, one, I agreed, but I also watched him performing, I don't know. I watched him do what I think a lot of artists do, which is pretend not to know things and derived from that a kind of strange power from powerlessness. And I kind of interrogated. I was like, come on, is that authentic to say I don't know when we're adults and we go into situations and we do know things? Well, when I went into Iraq, obviously I had information in my head. I knew things, I had taken notes. I thought I knew a lot. But when Moni said what she said to me as we were taking off to Iraq, I got what I think every artist needs, which is a sudden emotional jolt of I don't know. It's one thing intellectually to say, remember, you don't know anything. It's a very Socratic piece of wisdom. I know I don't know. The world begins with this. Any good thinking begins with this. Yes, but to really feel it, to get that fear that Moni blessed me with, that was a gift, and it was almost like an egolytic, like a drug that for about 2 weeks I was under the influence of. I remembered that I didn't know anything about every day that I was there, and yeah, it shaped almost every encounter that I had with people.
Wow. Okay. Baptized by fear. That's what I'm going to call my memoirs. So we have another question coming in, and which kind of ties in with what you were talking about. This is from Teresa. Did you have opportunities to meet a lot of Iraqis themselves, and how were you received by them?
Yeah, that's a question that gets right to the frustration and maybe even some of the anger that fuels this book. For the first week, even more than a week that I was in Iraq, Teresa, I didn't meet any Iraqis. I became aware in that week that I was part of a very plotted media embed. I was there to see what the military wanted me to see. And I was glad for the security. I certainly didn't want to be decapitated. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to be kidnapped. I wanted to come home safe to my family. I did not want any unnecessary danger, but I became very aware about a week in that this is bullshit. I'm not seeing the other side. My dad's advice to me before I left for Iraq was tell their story. What about them? Who's their George Washington? Who's their hero? Don't tell the same story that everybody else is telling, which is about the American military perspective. Our stories, what about them? It wasn't until a weekend when I finally got to Haditha that I met my first Iraqi. And after that point, I really started to push the people I was with to give me as many encounters as possible. Because of that, I was able to meet Captain Allah, the head of an Iraqi SWAT team. I was able to meet one of the fellas that the SEALs were giving a micro grant to run a taxi cab. I met a guy named Sheikh Dahan, who had been exposed to the burn pits. He lived downstream from the KBR burn pits. I met the mayor of Barawana, one of the 3 cities in the Haditha triad. I met a woman named Lucy who grew a garden right there on Nickel Base in Haditha. Luckily, once I got to Haditha, I got to meet a lot of Iraqis.
That's a great sort of recap of some of these wonderful people in your book. And your mention of Lucy made me think of this really great line that you have her say that you say about Lucy, that she had not forgotten I think it was the inconvenient detail of the human being. And I think that comes through in your memoir when you get out and meet all of these people and talk about the details of who they are. Let's see, we have a couple more questions coming in, which I'll find for you. But I also, well, this is sort of related. I was wondering if you could briefly just talk about this. This was my favorite quote in your book. There are 2 of my favorite quotes. I'll just read so people can really grasp, I think, the power of what you're doing in this memoir. One of your first is, on my best days, I know this, I do not want to be part of the amnesia, the book of laughter and forgetting. The second one that I wrote down separately is, here is the fundamental danger of history, empathy. So how did the memoir for you as you started to focus on these Iraqis themselves? The Sheikh you mentioned, who's got this huge cancerous growth on his leg, and his son's had like 39 cancer surgeries. Did your shift start to did your focus start to shift with the memoir itself, or did that happen after you got home and were putting all these stories together? How did that work?
Yeah, it changed everything. My dad gave me that advice, what about them, before I left, but I don't think it really started to sink in until that first interview with Allah. And even then, even after that whole time in Haditha, I'm not sure it entirely sank in. It wasn't until I started writing the book. You know, many people make the argument that we think through writing. And I think maybe it's Eudora Welty who says this. And I think when I really started to write this book and I started to confront solipsism, self-absorption, the way my story was weighing against the stories of not only the Iraqis who I had included in early drafts, but I had lots of notes for lots of encounters with the people of Haditha. And as I started going through drafts, I started realizing, why not bring them in? Why not bring this in? Why not bring this in? And it, like, I think like writing in general, it became a kind of spiritual exercise. How do you erase yourself? You know, the M&M bumper sticker, lose yourself. How do you do that? And I don't want to give away what I discover at the end of the book, but I started going down some rabbit holes, and I continued to do journalism when I got back to Greensboro, because Moni had told me, here in your backyard is the beginning of this war. Here is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was educated at the very school that you're teaching at. You don't know this. So when I got back from Greensboro, I started questioning everybody at the school that I went to. And I know I became very pesky because I had a door slammed in my face by the ex-president of the college, Edward Fort, who wanted nothing to do with me in a conversation about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And so I would drive out to the neighborhood where he lived. And I would just, you know, like an idiot, just sort of take notes in his front yard, knock on the doors of neighbors. And as I describe in the book, one night, I went to a place called Medina, which is was a hookah bar here in Greensboro. And it was very close to where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed used to live. And I asked the owner of the hookah bar if he knew Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, if he knew anybody who knew anybody. And he didn't say yes or no. He just said, you might want to talk to this man in the back. And he introduced me to a man named Khaled, who was sitting with his son in the back. And for about 45 minutes, Khaled told me he did not know Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He said he had been in Greensboro at the same time and was familiar with him, could give me some background on what it was like to be a Muslim, what it was like to be part of that community in the 1980s. But he said for about 45 minutes, I did not know him. And then in the middle of that conversation, he asked me why I wanted to know about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And that was when I told him about this book that you guys have in front of you, and what I cared about, which was essentially my father's question, bringing the other side into the conversation. And it was upon giving him that answer, he looks me in the eye and he says, I knew him. He was a friend of mine. And then he begins to tell me his story.
Right, and it's this fascinating story about how Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was educated at one of our nation's prestigious historically Black universities, right? And this whole rabbit trail that you follow, which I know he doesn't want me to give things away, but it is quite fascinating.
And also that he had a sense of humor.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed did?
That was what his friend said was more memorable than anything, was that he had a sense of humor. He had a great sense of humor. And I remember that rattling me more than anything he said. That
right.
That was what his friends all remembered about him. His nickname was Belushi. And that was not just a reference to John Belushi from Saturday Night Live, but also the Pakistani country where he was born, Baluchistan.
Yeah, and you make some excellent points there too about that so often you had thought of humor as something that tries to equalize people and bring them together. And then you have this interesting rumination about humor as a very dangerous distancing device, the wrong kind of humor, which is a really interesting thought. We have a lot of questions pouring in, so let me see what we have here. This is from Michael Carson, I believe. Love this idea of friendship, the nicknamed high school friend group as origin story. What is your relationship to your friend group now, Diet and the others? Has it changed any since your experience overseas?
Yeah, when we were all in high school, there was 7 of us, and there was 1 woman among us. And it was 6 guys and 1 girl.
Poor thing.
And we've lost one member. One member died last year, and we temporarily lost the woman, but then she came back. Her name's Betsy. If you're out there, Betsy, hello. And now we remain friends, but obviously it's a lot different than it was in high school. Most of the folks in the group, we called ourselves the Cobras in high school, not Cobra Kai. We were not those guys. We called ourselves the Cobras. And everybody's changed. Everybody's got kids. Everybody has jobs. We're all more or less mature, more or less adults. But this book has been a crucible. You know, it's been a test. I wasn't sure about a year ago if my friendship with Diet would last after publication of this book. Right to my left, I can remember sitting in that chair and having a very intense conversation with him about this book. We had to have, I think, the kind of honest conversation that I'd like to see a lot of people in this country have. It nearly broke our friendship, but because we had it, because there was some fearless honesty, because we tested each other, our friendship grew. And I won't say that he's thrilled about the book now. He's not, but we've gotten past it, and we remain close. And everybody in the group, with the exception of Diet, has been very supportive. Diet has not undermined it. He's been quiet about it. And I think when you read the book, you'll understand why.
Let's see what else we have. This is, do you think language has the ability to fully represent other people's stories and experiences? I'm thinking of politics of recognition. That's from Mara.
Mara, great question. And I think that the short answer is no. I'm not even entirely sure language can represent our own experiences. I don't think anything ever fully tells anybody's story. And maybe that's one of the reasons I'm so obsessed with the idea of mystery. Even in this memoir, as the minister who I grew up with said when he read the book, he said, "And you encountered another mystery in the end, didn't you, Matt? You." You know, it's true. I don't think you find the whole of me in this book. I think you find me contending with a lot of voices and roles, and I do think you get a glimpse of that thing that's constantly molting, shedding skin. But when it comes to other people, I do the best I can, and I think we all know that this is a really tricky game. Empathy can be dangerous. Empathy can be fake. It can be faked. Even when it is well-intentioned, it never gets all the way there. But what would we be like? Where would we be if we stopped trying to understand each other? We're never going to get, I think, fully there, but I know that I deeply appreciate it, and I know that I feel closer with people when they try.
Yeah, you have a great line, something about friendship is taking an active interest in one another. And it seems like, if nothing else, you and Diet managed to achieve that consistently. We have another question. Let's see. Have you gone back to Haditha ever since?
No, I have not gone back to Haditha as in the same capacity. I've not been to the actual place, but over the last year, I've been in very close contact with a growing community of Iraqi writers, and also a man in Haditha, as I'm starting to do some follow-up journalism to the book, because I realized in writing the book that some of the questions that I've raised, I'd like to really know the answer to. And I think you get some answers in the book, but I think particularly when it comes to the burn pits, when it comes to what we have done to the landscape of Iraq, what we've done to the landscape of Haditha, I want to know just how bad it is. And I want to know if there's anything we know with our own soldiers that they're experiencing the Agent Orange of our generation, that this has been disastrous for them, this exposure to the toxins that we burned in those KBR burn pits. I've been trying to answer through a man I've contacted through Twitter in Haditha, if what happened there and what I describe in my book, I want to know the dimensions of the fallout there. So I have been in conversation with Hadithans, and I'm not going to talk about exactly what he has said, but I will say that there's a story there. This story will continue. Yeah.
It's interesting that you use the word dimensions, because I feel like that could really be sort of the distillation of your book, is that you were interested in the dimensions of everything around you, of the individual person, of the scope of the war, of the scope of social media. All of this, you interrogate it so intelligently in your memoir. And I don't know, I just really like that you use that word dimensions. It seems a lot like what you are trying to do. We have a question from Consequence magazine. It's been quite a few years since you've come back from Iraq, and you've had time to shape these memories into a wonderful narrative. How has distance and maturity influenced the way you tell the story?
Good question. Am I fully mature at this point? I don't think so.
I think you are. Oh, good.
Have I gotten more distance? And am I more mature? Yeah. Yeah. And I'll answer the question as directly as I can. The older I get, and what it was like working with the final draft of this book, and what I'm trying to do in the follow-up stories and the work that I'm doing right now, is I am trying to do that thing that I think Mara suggested just a few questions ago is impossible. I'm trying to get as close as I can to the perspective of the Iraqis. I've built relationships with Iraqi writers, and I'm working with them. As I told you, I'm still in contact with folks in Haditha. I think this is the challenge that Mara brings up. Can we ever tell those stories? What's the point in doing it if we know we can't? I know I can't, but what maturity and distance is telling me is I need less distance. I need to get closer to the Iraqi point of view. I need to read Iraqi literature. I need to spend time with Iraqi writers. I need to, and if anybody out there is looking for a good book, check out Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadawi. There is a wealth of Iraqi literature. We can understand this war not just through journalists who go over there and talk to Iraqis. There are Iraqis who are writing about this war, and their point of view is sometimes wonderfully disorienting, sometimes horrifically defamiliarizing. But I think it's really important that we try to go there. It's an incredible body of literature that's out there.
Here is another question from Steve, which I think is a really good one. I'll give a little background for other listeners, but your father was very, very opposed, as you said, to you going to Iraq, and it caused a big fight. So yeah. Steve wants to know how, if your trip to Haditha fundamentally changed your relationship with your father, or if you think it changed how he sees you.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, Steve. When I first got back, the hug I got from my dad when I went home just about a month later was one I'll never forget. I knew that even in his opposition to me going there, it was out of love. He thought that his father, my grandfather, was dying, and he was. My grandfather died that very year. He thought his wife, my mother, She held on, but this was happening all around him. And he thought his son might die in that same year. He thought he was going to lose these three incredibly close people in his family. And when I got back from Iraq, we bonded in a way we never had before. We've gotten a lot closer. That doesn't mean we agree on everything now. We don't. Sometimes we still disagree passionately. And the Iraq War and the war on terror in general is definitely not something we are just suddenly on board with together. We don't have the same point of view. It can still get really testy, but I'll tell you something. He was a doctor at the time, and a number of his patients would just come in and give him the articles in the Winchester Star that I had written. One of them even laminated one of them and gave it to him. You know, never underestimate the power of lamination. And we had a local congresswoman who also sent him a special laminated copy. And, you know, it almost feels ridiculous and egotistical to say this, but my dad was proud of me. People were talking about his son, and he was proud that his son had sold his first stories. And I was proud to have done so. I think he started taking me seriously as a writer. I think he started taking me seriously as a thinker, and maybe I started taking myself seriously at that point. It's been good for us.
Good. Steve also wanted to know if it has, if that trip that you wrote about changed your music at all.
Yeah, good question, Steve. For those of you who don't know, I'm in a band called Viva la Muerte, and I was in that band back in 2008 when I went to Iraq. And in my journal, which is right here, I'm always just sort of scrawling notes for novels, songs, so on and so forth. When I was there, I wrote a song called 1111, and it ends up on our first album, Viva la Muerte's first album, All the Birds. If anybody wants to listen to it, you can hear, I think probably one of the more ambitious songs that we've done. You can hear these two voices. You've got this first, and I don't want to decode it too much, but it's very much me. And then you've got this second voice, and it's very much, well, it's a soldier that I met when I was in Haditha. The voices that I encountered over there, they started pouring into everything. They started pouring into my fiction. They started pouring into my songwriting. Another song on that first album, Stellar Wind, is about the government's illegal surveillance program. It's an instrumental. I don't think it says anything intelligent about that surveillance program, but I was just thinking about these things. And whether it's 1111, Stellar Wind, or a number of other songs, what I saw in Haditha transformed me, and I've been wrangling with it in both music, poetry, fiction, journalism, all of that ever since I got back.
Berger wants to know what you think of social media as a publishing platform.
As a publishing platform, like as a place to publish one's thoughts, or as a place to discuss this thing that you've published?
I don't know if it's elaborated on. Let me see. What are your thoughts?
He says the first one.
What are your thoughts about social media?
The first, as a place to publish one's thoughts. Yeah, thanks for the question, Adrian. You and I are friends on Twitter, and I sometimes think, wonder what Adrian thinks about this. You know, because sometimes I just say stupid stuff out there, and sometimes I just say angry stuff. Sometimes I'm very proud of myself, and then I'm even like, oh, you're being way too proud of yourself. I can't stand social media most of the time. But then again, every once in a while, I'll make contact with somebody like Joseph Hickman, former guard at Guantanamo Bay, and we'll develop a friendship. And from that friendship comes a whole new world. Develop a friendship with you, Adrian, like through Facebook. Sometimes, like what's happening with Wrath Bearing Tree on Twitter, seeing the community agitated, seeing you guys supporting each other, seeing that really unique military writing community, that has been beautiful. Seeing, and this is the most humbling thing, feeling like I'm at least peripherally a part of it. You know, you guys have been so kind to me in letting me into these conversations, even as I'm sort of studying you for my dissertation. That part's been really wonderful. Publishing thoughts there, because I am thinking about you guys in that way, just racks me with self-consciousness. But I also want to test them out, so I'm very curious to see what you guys think. So yeah, it's a very loaded, complicated experience.
We're almost out of time. I personally am curious how you are received teaching at a predominantly Quaker college and writing so much about military issues. Has that ever become a problem for you? Are you able to explain yourself the way you would like to the people around you?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. Guilford College, I think, is one of the great monuments to peace in the United States. It is a place where sometimes I take my students on walks into the Guilford Forest. And back there, you can see an old poplar tree that was posted along the Underground Railroad. Still there. You can see a college full of people, the original hippies. You still see these bearded Quakers everywhere. These people who've powerfully resisted war for hundreds of years. They're everywhere. And many of them, I'd say almost all of them, they're not naive. When somebody comes into the college, most of them did not instantly judge me, but many of them were very cautious, and almost all of them, when I did sit down for those initial conversations, they wanted to know about my relationship to war. The fact of my time having been over there, that was the thing that was of greatest interest to them, and it probably did reflect some skepticism. Who is this person who looks like this, you know, this short-haired guy who kind of has this, maybe even sort of military bearing, writing about the military. That's not what we're about. Guilford doesn't even allow military recruiters on campus. In my first couple years there, most of the students who would sign up for my classes were athletes, football players, people, I think, who sort of identified with the monolithic identity of the military that many probably associated me with. But as time has gone on, I've made some real allies over there, and I've had my thinking tested in some really good ways. And I think even some of the young, extremely liberal hippie kids in the college recognize that I'm not there to secretly promote violence.
We want to thank Matt and Andrea for taking their time with us today. If you think these conversations are important, we hope you'll consider subscribing to Consequence Magazine and supporting our other co-sponsors, including the Rathbearing Tree, Scuppernong Books, and the Paul Pratt Memorial Library. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and have a great night. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you guys so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrea.
Anytime.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks,
Thank you, Kat. Thank you guys for coming.
I can put on my accessory now.
Yeah, you know, I was about to bring that up, and